Um, Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the next talk in the Making Sense of Complexity series. Joining us this morning is Dayna Baumeister, and her topic this morning is called Learning from Nature, Lessons from the Planet's Oldest Complex Adaptive System. So I am going to, without further ado, turn it over to Dayna. Apologies. Before I do, if you have any questions throughout the talk, please feel free to drop those in the chat or save them to ask at the end.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, everybody. I'm glad to be here, although I'm not actually physically there in Arizona. I live in Bellingham, Washington, so I have a different sort of background, not a desert background in my space. Let me start by sharing my screen here. So I'm going to do a little bit of a different kind of talk than probably you're used to seeing in this forum. I thought it might be nice to talk a little bit about the Biomimicry Center and actually introduce myself, because I'm in these faculty meetings, but I've never met the vast majority of you in person, and a little bit about who I am and why I'm here. So that's the goal here, and see if there might be something that can emerge from that. So a little bit about me. I've been working in the field of biomimicry since 1998. So over 24 years. I connected with the author of the book, Biomimicry, in 1998, and we've been working side by side ever since. I did get a PhD in organismic biology and ecology, so I'm a biologist by training, although I've never, except for recently, actually been working in academia, at least part-time, because I've been working with organizations and businesses around the world. So I co-founded a benefit corp called Biomimicry 3.8 and a nonprofit called the Biomimicry Institute, which are both flourishing in the world today. I did write the only textbook that's available for biomimicry called the Biomimicry Resource Handbook. It is a textbook for our graduate program, and we offer the only master's degree in biomimicry anywhere in the world here at ASU. I currently have two jobs. I'm half-time ASU and half-time partner at Biomimicry 3.8. My current clients include Microsoft, Procter Gamble, Ford, Mattel, Jacobs, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And so I really believe strongly in bringing the practice, the real world practice, to the educational space. And then since 2015, I've been director of the Biomimicry Center. I shared a director position for a while now. I'm only the director, and then head of the Biomimicry graduate programs at Arizona State. I'm actually a professor of practice, which I think is very appropriate, because I am bringing the practice into the academic space. So I wanted to spend just a little bit of time talking about what biomimicry is for those that may not be familiar, and share a couple of examples, and then dig into what we're doing at the center and with the graduate program. So comes from Greek, to emulate life. And there's a lot of really important elements that are around bringing these lessons from biology and bringing them together with the realm of design and innovation and technology. And it's that intersection is the space in which we work and we teach and offer our services. What I find really interesting among many, many things around biomimicry is its potential to offer entirely different ways of thinking about how we do things. There was a study done that did an overlap of, nature's technologies, if you will, nature's technologies of how it goes about solving problems and the act of patents, and found only a 12% overlap. And so there's really this huge potential for thinking differently about how we solve our problems. And I've got a few examples to share with you. At its basic core, what biomimicry is about is asking the question of how might nature address the design challenges that we have. I use design very loosely to refer to just about anything we humans create. We have to cross what we call the function bridge head over to the biological realm, ask those questions. And then we're not bringing biology back, but we're bringing back what we call the abstracted design principle, the lesson, if you will. We can look to nature and look at forms, at processes, at ecosystems, and all have potential to inform how we do things. So here's some examples. Everything from, this is an SEM of the abdomen of a firefly, and looking at how it's able to magnify the light that's produced through bioluminescence inside its abdomen. And that coating, that structure of those scales was recreated on LED light bulbs in order to increase the brilliance of the light coming out of the light bulbs and increase that reflectance. So mimicking a form. At a more macro scale, this is a fan that mimics the extra serration that owl feathers have that keep them ultra quiet. And those serrations, as you can see, were put on the blade of the fan to result in an ultra quiet fan blade. But you can also scale up to even really, really large scales. This is a concentrated solar facility in which the mirrors, you can actually get optimal packing of mirrors in a limited amount of space, which is the same design challenge that a sunflower has, the optimal packing of seeds in a limited seed head space. And when you do that, you can end up with, I think it's about 18% more reflective mirrors in the same area, which of course for concentrated solar is really powerful. There's also form examples that inform, how we do electrodes. So rather than having for fuel cells, rather than having all these straight linear lines, by mimicking the branching pattern that you see in sea fans, you get an optimal distribution of surface area, which is ultimately, of course, what's important inside a fuel cell. Even in material science, we can get down to the micro, and this is the super strong, what's called a dactyl club on this shrimp, has a helicoid structure, and using 3D printing now, it's possible to actually replicate that 3D structure and end up with much more resilient materials, just like the dactyl club, by mimicking that structure. This particular one looks at self-shaping materials by mimicking the way pine cone bracts open and close with humidity, and building that phenomena into different kinds of materials. You can, of course, imagine that sort of self-responsive kinds of opportunities when there are humidity controls. But then we can also move not just materials in the shape or form, but even how they're made. This is a new technology in aerogel manufacturing that was inspired by how the dragonfly wings firm up. And it turns out that the dragonfly actually pumps CO2 into the wings as it's in that drying phase. And it's the CO2 that helps displace the water and help the wings dry. And they were able to mimic that to make a much more effective, more cost-effective manufacturing for aerogels, which of course are an incredible lightweight, very, very low material insulation. This is a process example as well. This is new vaccines that mimic tardigrades and tardigrades' ability to desiccate without water and, of course, go into a stasis. And that anhydrobiosis process has been replicated in vaccines so that vaccines do not need to be refrigerated. Super important for maintaining their stability, especially in places like Africa where you can't have that consistent cold chain always guaranteed. So from the small, but then you can get into electronics. In fact, most of us have this particular technology in our cell phones. This is mimicking the way our own ears are able to discern and pick out only the sounds we want to hear and kind of block out the white noise by looking at that connection between our ears and our neuronal pathways and modeling that in the algorithms for the software that's in our cell phones. This technology called EarSmart is now commonplace in our mobile devices. This shows up in cars. Volvo now has this in its vehicles. It mimics the way locusts avoid crashing into each other. They were actually able to look at the way the neurons fire, and basically a locust compares one image of its surroundings to the next image of its surroundings in a very, very rapid pace. And if it notices a drastic change, that is a locust getting too close, it makes a corrective action. And so that design principle is what's built into this Volvo collision detector, that it's taking these rapid images, comparing them in real time, and then if there's too dramatic of a change, then it takes corrective action. Also in the traffic realm, we might not just look at one organism, but of course the collective behavior of organisms. I really like this in terms of how information travels. There's a lot of work, of course, in swarm intelligence. And they found when they modeled this in a city in China, in Guangzhou, they were able to significantly reduce the amount of idling time, and therefore reducing fuel consumption and smog pollution, simply by following those collective decision-making and information sharing algorithms in swarms. Similarly, swarms can also help us understand better how to do routing. This is a software called Routific that's inspired by how bees best optimize their path through the flowers in order to ensure they're not overflying in order to find the pollen that they need. And this has been super powerful for delivery companies, which have a different route every day in order to also optimize fuel, reduce pollution. So fun technologies in that space. I really like this one. This is a generative engineering process. This actually comes out of Germany, where they are looking at optimal forms and structures. So it's combining form with process by looking at diatoms and the really, really rich wealth of diatoms patterns that are out there, which of course have a lot of structural elements that are key, and then using that to do lightweighting of all sorts of parts. Of course, lightweighting means less material use, less manufacturing and energy, and then also because it's lighter, it's a lot less carbon to move whatever it is that we've lightweighted. Speaking of carbon, this is a process one that shows up in a material. This mimics the way that coral formation actually grabs carbon and bicarbonate from the seawater to form a hard material. What I really think is interesting about this one is that this is Brent Constance. He's not replacing the cement, although he has done that. He's actually replacing the aggregate. So a carbon fixating aggregate, which of course by ton is a much more significant element of concrete, and has actually created a truly negative carbon concrete that it sequesters more carbon than is produced in the process by looking at the way corals solidify. Now, this is another coral example where through 3D printing and using a process that is similar in that cement manufacturing, not just is sequestering carbon, it's actually 3D printing and replicating the form of coral texture, which you can see on the right, so that when they build artificial reefs, it has a higher likelihood of new corals growing because it mimics the way when a polyp lands, it recognizes it as a coral surface and is more likely to settle. So some real important innovations happening in the artificial reef realm as well. But we can also make plastic, so it doesn't just happen to have to happen in a wet environment. These folks have mimicked the process of that's happening when you're fixing sugars in photosynthesis. And of course, making a sugar as a short chain polymer, making a long chain polymer by mimicking those processes and really sequestering carbon to put into plastics. But then we can go all the way up to the system level. This is work out of Kansas at the Land Institute. that looked at what are the properties that make a tallgrass prairie thrive, and could we build that into our agricultural systems. And so they have been working on both reperennializing our crops and then creating polycultures, because a tallgrass prairie has cool season grasses, warm season grasses, legumes, and sunflowers. And a huge proportion of our crops fall in those 4 categories. And so they're working on those techniques so that we don't need to till, we don't need to add pesticides, we don't need to add fertilizers. And so here you have a whole systems level mimicry that's really transforming the way we think about doing big ag. And then my last example here is actually one that we recently worked on here at ASU. The Biomimicry Center brought in one of the clients of Biomimicry 3.8, Kimberly Clark, where we had done a project on how nature cycles nutrients and the sort of deep design lessons and principles on nutrients. And so they asked to do a circular economy project for Africa, going into Africa and looking at how they can better design and manage for the diaper disposal problem that's in Africa. So we worked with students and brought that report in and came up with some design concepts that are now in the prototyping stage through Kimberly Clark. So at that systems level. So that's a quick view just to give you a little bit of a sense. Hopefully you can see from that there's a huge diversity of applications, which is one of the things that I really love about this work, is lots of opportunities to interface with many, many different types of expertise. So the Biomimicry Center has been at the university since 2015. It is actually a joint endeavor between Biomimicry 3.8, which is the consulting firm, and ASU, and again, where I wear my 2 hats. And we started actually as a center in the provost's office. In 2013, Michael Crow sent Ponch and Rob Page up to Montana and said, hey, we'd like you to bring biomimicry to ASU. And so we started off as a center in the provost's office, and the graduate program, which we built, started in Seoul's. And then just in this last creation of the Global Futures, we were moved over to the School of Complex Adaptive Systems. So we have 3 important directions, and I'll give you some examples of what we do in each of these. One, which we're calling the extension service. We like to think of ourselves as being like an extension service, but in service of biomimicry for ASU writ large. We have the educational component. We have both the online programs and some on-campus programs, and then something we call Nature Maker, which I'll show you some pictures of later. So I'll talk first about the extension service, and I'm actually going to come back to these bullets. First, I just wanted to just call out and acknowledge how the growth of biomimicry from a research perspective is happening. I pulled this data just recently from NSF, and this is the number of awards that have been given annually. And you can see, obviously, there's been an increase over the last 20 years. From the National Science Foundation for Biomimicry. This is the award list from the Institute of Health, a similar sort of trajectory and an increase. These are search terms of biomimetic, bioinspired, and biomimicry. But they come from a lot of different parts of NSF. This is from the NSF organization. So you can see there's a wide distribution, which is what is part of the reason why I decided to come to ASU, because of the size of the university and the diversity of faculty. It's a really incredible place to touch on all of these potentials of where biomimicry can show up and influence what's happening. And so here, just a quick example, you have over 2,000 NSF awards, so almost 5,000 NIH awards for more than $1 billion that's been awarded in this space. Of course, not as big as other places, but for really what's considered an emerging discipline, I think this shows the potential of where this might go and the uniqueness. Actually, NSF asked me to come out and speak there, and I spoke to both the engineering and the biology directorates about the potential for that intersection and what could what could emerge. So huge potential that we should be really thinking about how we can tap further into. And then as an example, like this is actually a little bit of an older list, but these are our affiliates, the number of affiliates that we have in the different schools across the campus. And you can see that widespread appeal of how biomimicry can relate to so many different disciplines. So we've actually just landed a grant called the Lab to Market grant. And the idea behind the funding here is to look at the ecosystem of what's happening with biomimicry across the campus and identify those technologies, those inventions, and solutions that have the highest potential to move to market and help create some of those pathways. At the same time, it gives us the opportunity to really get to know even further what's happening in all of these different places, and then be able to connect, right? So you're looking for this kind of, say, biological background, we can connect you with those folks. Or, oh, you're working on dendritic patterns, well, then you need to talk to these electronics folks. And there's a lot of ways that we can really see becoming the facilitators and helping generate some really important transdisciplinary projects. One that we're really excited about that's getting going is some work with Tim Long, who's super excited about the whole realm of bio-inspired materials and bio-inspired chemistry and what that might mean for a lot of the sustainability challenges, of course, which are so critical for all of us to consider. And then the last thing that we're working on is sort of the, with IRA is a sort of a menu of options that can be available to people working on things where we can help bring in this biomimetic perspective, help frame proposals with that unique way. We can also, through my work with Biomimicry 3.8, identify external partners, corporations, et cetera, that would be interested in really putting that solution into immediate practice, as well as some broader impact work, which will show up when I talk about our last piece here. Okay, so from the education side of things, we do faculty training. We've had a couple of weekend workshops just for those faculty that are interested and want to learn more. We've also done week-long immersions with some faculty over the years. So there's maybe a dozen or so faculty that have had the week-long immersions. We show up as guests in different classes to talk about what biomimicry is, and that applies all over campus. As I mentioned, we have, through the online program, the Masters of Science. I'm going to delve into that a little bit more deeply, as well as a graduate certificate. We have a campus-based undergraduate certificate, which is available for the entire campus. Anybody in any discipline can add this certificate to it. And then we've been helping Innovation Space embed biomimicry, which is started in the design school, but it connects engineering and business and biology and design. And next year, we're going to dive in and have a biomimicry dedicated course in the education realm there. So I know you guys are starting up your some online masters. So I thought I'd share a little bit about our program and find out if, so what we're doing and if there's intersections that might be useful and helpful on our lessons learned. Which are a lot of lessons learned. So we started in the fall of 2015. We've had almost 600 applicants to the program. 83% acceptance. We have an 83% retention rate. If they drop out, they usually drop out after the first semester and they just realize that maybe online learning is not for them, or it's harder than they thought. We've graduated 195. Now, what's I think is interesting here, the graduate certificate is nested in the master's degree. So the first 13 of the 15 credits of the graduate certificate can actually then morph into the master's. So I expected a lot of people to enroll in the certificate and then transfer up to the master's. What we found is that a lot of people do both. They want both. And very quickly in the first semester after enrolling in the certificate, they move up to the master's. But the nice thing about having the certificate as a subset, if they totally bomb the master's, then they can actually still leave with a certificate if they obviously pass those classes. So they have an option to opt out. We have 94 students currently enrolled. We enroll 3 times a year, summer, fall, and spring, and we get about 10 to 15 students every semester. So I think we've got about 12 that are looking like they'll enroll this summer. Highly international. We have a lot, and there's the advantage of being online, makes it super easy, and they come from all over the world. Less so Asia, but a good chunk of the rest of the world. There's the program that focuses on students from the Middle East. So we have a fairly substantial number of students from the Middle East in our program as well. Also interesting that more than 20% already hold graduate degrees, including I have people with law degrees, I have doctors with medical degrees, and PhDs that are showing up and taking this program. So they really see that advantage of bringing that to their work. They're also an older population. So the majority are older than 30 years, more female than male, and the vast majority of them are working at least part-time, and really most of them full-time. So they're working professionals. So it's a very different audience than fresh out of undergrad in the program. This is our calendar that we put together so students can build out their IPOS. But what I want to call your attention to is the way that we've structured the program. We have a set of sort of foundational core courses that are required, a collection of electives that they can pick and choose in terms of how they anticipate applying biomimicry in the world. And then we actually do not have a thesis as our program sort of culmination. They have to take 3 of the 4 practicums. And so they actually build a portfolio that demonstrates the breadth of their ability to apply biomimicry rather than the narrowed focus of their ability to apply biomimicry. And then at the end, they have to do a sort of a presentation of their portfolio, the breadth of what they've learned in the program to graduate. So it's a little bit different in terms of how we have that structured. Then we have 2 key elements of the program, or sort of 2 key tools. These are our methodology that's behind biomimicry. They look like simple diagrams, but there's an incredible amount of work that it takes to learn how to walk through these processes, these systems. Just like the scientific method, you teach it in one way, and of course it's much more messy when you actually do it. But these are the 2 ways you can start with biological insights and come up with solutions that you take to design, or as I presented earlier, you can have a challenge, you go to nature and ask for advice, and then ultimately solve that. The other big tool, and I wanted to share with you all because I think this is probably the most relevant to the world that you're all in. We call this Life's Principles. And this was a many, many years in development. And it represents the guidelines and the rules that really all of life follows. These are like the universal deep patterns, or let's say 99.9% of all species follow these. And our premise in the work of biomimicry is, if we as a species want to do well on the planet and not shortlist ourselves on the extinction list, perhaps we should also try to follow these things in our actions, our designs, our work in the world. So this is a very powerful tool that we use both with organizations and companies at Biomimicry 3.8, and we teach it in the program. And I'm sharing it with you all because I have a question at the end. I've been working on a paper to document why these are the life's principles. And so it's a super long paper with a lot of citations, because the whole point is to say, yes, this is a ubiquitous phenomena as evidenced by all of these other papers. So I'd love to have a little dialogue with anybody who's interested in that question with me later. But I'm going to just quickly go through them again. But I think if you're interested in this question of, the oldest complex adaptive system, I think you'd be very curious in the worlds that you all work and do your research if you see overlaps and patterns in what you're documenting with what that we've found, and the biologists that have worked on this with me are happening in nature. So let me back up real quick. This is we have sort of these 6 master, those are the green ones on the outside, that are contained within the context of the planet. So the planet has some operating conditions, non-negotiable operating conditions. And it is because of those operating conditions that these behaviors and responses have arisen. I could argue lots of different ways to organize these 26 principles, but this seems to be the ones that most works. So the master principle and then the subs. And I like to think about it as at the center of the diagram, ultimately in the largest context for 3.8 billion years, we can say that life has created conditions conducive to life. Then you ask the question, how? And the answers are what's in the life's principles. So, well, by adapting to changing conditions. Well, how do you adapt to changing conditions? Well, then you do these sub-principles. So that's how it's set up. Be locally attuned and responsive. Makes a lot of sense, right? And I guess let me also say that these are written in a way to be understandable and appealing to a much larger audience. I'm not writing them in a super academic way, but they're designed to be accessible. So how do you go about being locally attuned and responsive? Well, make use of what's available in terms of material and energy by cultivating cooperative relationships. I actually did my PhD on facilitation between 2 different plant species. And we actually see a lot more cooperation in nature than we see competition. And so that's a call out to that. Life also leverages existing cyclic processes, be it night and day, tides, anything that is predictable actually helps you become locally attuned. And as you might imagine, feedback loops, short, transparent, authentic feedback loops generally are the norm. But there's changes, right? We live in a world of dynamic non-equilibrium, and so life has to adapt to those changing conditions. And it does so by a process of self-renewal, which helps maintain integrity. It embodies resilience through 3 deep patterns of variation, redundancy, and decentralization. And it incorporates diversity. And having a diversity available means that when things change, you've got something that you can draw upon. And then, of course, over a long time, life evolves to survive, which is ultimately about incorporating and embodying information so that you can ensure long-term performance. That includes replicating strategies that work, also known as how we pass on our genes. But then you have mutations in the genes, so integrating the unexpected, and then reshuffling information, also known as sex, right? So we're mixing those genes. Those are key elements of what we know as natural selection and the process of evolve to survive. Chemistry is an important one. It's important to talk about that there's ultimately a life-friendly chemistry at its deepest pattern. And what that means is that there's, we know that life uses a lot of shape in chemistry. So it uses selectively in the sense of how those pieces fit together. It's very much an elegant process as opposed to the way that a lot of human chemistry is designed. It's very crude. It forces molecules together. And nature tends to use a much smaller subset of the periodic table of elements than we do. And there's probably a reason for that. And then it breaks down those products into benign constituents. So while there certainly are toxins in nature, when they break down, they don't become more toxic, which is unfortunately the case for a lot of human created molecules. and polymers. And then lastly, life does chemistry in water. We tend to use, water is the solvent. And of course, we use much more reactive solvents in how we do our chemistry. We actually have a chemist at Biomimicry 3.8 that's broken this down into a lot more details, but this is that really high level processes at play. This one is probably the most obvious one, especially in the world of sustainability, and where a lot of the work of sustainability has focused forever, is just working on reducing material and energy consumption. But of course, there's a lot more to how life is ultimately making it work. But we had to talk about this. So this is both skillfully and conservatively taking advantage of what's available. And the way you can go about doing that is life loves multifunctional design. I have this image of this duck up here, and it's preening. And it turns out that preen oil that it is cleaning its feathers with, you simultaneously are cleaning and smoothing the feathers, applying the preen oil, which keeps the feathers supple, kind of like putting lotion on your hands. And then the preen oil in the presence of sunlight breaks down into vitamin D. So as it preens, it drags the feathers through its mouth. It's also getting its vitamin dose, right? So life just really leverages that multifunctional design, which of course allows for resource efficiency. Life loves low energy processes, a little different than the way humans tend to do things. Recycles all materials, that's obvious, but not in a glass bottle to glass bottle kind of way, or a leaf back into a leaf kind of way, but in a larger nutrient cycling system. And then the last is really leveraging form to achieve function. And then the last of the principles is integrating development with growth. So this is processes over time. We know in our cultures, we tend to put a lot more emphasis on growth at the expense of development, or too much on development without enough on growth. And then you end up with, weak, flimsy trees, or, something like Dubai, where you have all of this infrastructure, you've built all these buildings and they're mostly empty. So there's a key to really, balance those. And this includes things like combining modular and nested components, allows you to build incrementally over time, building from the bottom up instead of top down, and using some of those principles of self-organizing. So that was like a really fast speed through those life principles. I actually teach a 4-credit graduate level class on that set of slides right there. That is a full 15 weeks long. And then that's just their first pass through it. And then they use it and work with it in the graduate program elsewhere. But I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of it, just to see if there was something that felt like it might intersect with your work. And then also help me think about my challenge around publishing. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then the last thing I wanted to share with you is our what we call the Nature Maker space. This is our outreach. This is our sort of interface with the larger community. We've built exhibits and kits. We have these talks where we bring in faculty and others to talk about how they're doing this. And we have an incredible space. We're actually over in Design South. That picture up on the left, we have a whole bunch of biological artifacts. So people can come in and actually look up close at a dragonfly wing. They can put it under the microscope, and they can begin to think about, how does this apply? I'm an architect. How might I think about how I do my designs? This kits on the right were some work we did with this zoo, the Phoenix Zoo, for their traveling zoo, to help learn about biomimicry. This is all standards-based middle school components and we have these boxes and kits that get shipped out to teachers all over Arizona. Even our space, which is some pictures of it here, was designed using life's principles. We have a whole display on how we use life's principles in the design, and it's won some awards for interior remodels. And so I invite you all, you're all welcome to come visit us in Design South and see what it's like. Anybody who walks in this space is just like, it just feels really good to be in that space. So that's the other piece of what we do in this outreach realm. So just to close and open up, I'm more than happy to answer any questions or talk about what anybody wants to talk about, but I have sort of 5 things that I'll put out there. As I mentioned, I'm writing up this paper. It's 30,000 words long with over 300 citations, because I'm documenting the ubiquity of all of these things across life. And as you might imagine, all journals have word count limits and citation limits. And so I'm a little stuck in this space. I'd love some ideas on where we could get that out. I feel really confident. I can't say I've necessarily captured all the principles, but I feel really good about the ones that we do have. So looking for some ideas on that. Anything that came up for you on opportunities to intersect what we do with maybe your research, always open to hearing about those. Love exchanging ideas for creative and effective best practices in online education. Been doing it now for a while, thinking a lot about it. As you can see, we ran a lot of people through our program, constantly evolving, and happy to share and talk about that. As part of that lab to market grant that we have, we'd love to find out who's looking to nature for inspiration, but maybe hasn't named it explicitly. So they might be a little bit harder for us to find in our searching and our tools that we have for searching. So if you know anybody, I know that, of course, Ted in SCAS is definitely doing that. And he was involved, especially in the beginning years of the center. But anybody else that you know that's, again, not naming it, we want to know about. And then the last is we're shifting some of our emphasis moving forward to become a bridge between the design school and HIDA and the College of Global Futures, because as you could probably imagine, there's a lot of overlap. And I'd love to hear from any of you on ideas that you might see from this Global Futures side of how you'd like to connect more with the design school, and if the Biomimicry Center can help facilitate that. So that's a little bit about who we are and what we do, who I am. Hopefully it sparked some ideas or some thoughts and inspiration, and at least open up the conversation. So I will stop sharing and then be open for any questions.
Thanks, Dana. I don't see a question in the chat, but if anybody wants to ask a question, feel free to either raise your hand or type it in the chat, and then that way we can facilitate those questions. Oh, Michael, it looks like you've already raised your hand, so why don't you go ahead?
Dana, thank you for this. This was really fascinating. It's interesting to think about, how do notions of like methodological rigor square with biomimicry? Like, does biomimicry care that much about certain aspects of methodological rigor? Is getting an inspiration from a biological system, an acceptable outcome for biomimicry, or is there a certain process that's important to maintain?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that we talk about with the students is that it's both an art and a science. And that if they get too caught up on the science side, then they're not going to be as creative as they need. But if they're too liberal with their creativity, then they could bastardize the science. And so for us, it's important, I guess there's twofold. When we talk about biomimicry, we actually think there's 3 essential elements to it that take it deeper than what we would call bio-inspired design. It comes from a premise of humbleness and recognizing that, yes, we have these big, huge brains, but there's a lot that we need to learn. And so if we can step back and be more systematic in how we go through the methodology, by not quickly jumping to the first idea and being like, oh, look at clever me, I have a thing to run with, then we can actually get a lot more richness out of the process. We also have built into the methodology the inclusion of the life's principles, because my work has always been from the beginning that let's put these ideas to good use, right? Like, let's make sure that we're not building a better nuclear bomb using nature's ideas. Like, let's make sure we're actually solving the challenges that need to be solved and solving them in a way that doesn't add more problems and doesn't do more harm. So by bringing in life's principles and being more rigorous with the use of the methodology, that moves us closer in that step. Now, there's certainly people working in the field of bioinspiration that are more than happy to have just gotten an insight, but I feel like they've left so much on the table by not using a little bit more rigor. So we do definitely teach that for our students. The other thing, and of course we practice it in our work, the other thing that we insist on is that the biology better be good. Like, you're not allowed to abstract it in such a way that you've falsified it, or you've just really, just made it not legitimate. Like, so the science needs to be solid that way. So that is a key piece of what we teach.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Brian, I see your hands raised.
Yeah, thanks. Very inspiring talk and great to hear. And I don't have a well-formulated question here, but just maybe to say that, we should connect at some later point. But, I find myself sort of motivating my work recently in these same kind of terms of sort of finding principles by which, so I'm working on collective behavior, which you mentioned, but right, what are the principles or the design patterns that that you see in nature? And so I'm not working yet, at least on the design side. It's all from the biology side, I guess. So that really I'm coming from physics. But trying to find, what are the patterns of information, as you mentioned, information moving around in collectives that can help them to do things in a better way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I found that inspiring, and I like this idea of even trying to ask the question, like, what are the patterns of life, is interesting to me. So yeah, no real question here, but I think there is definitely a lot of overlap, and I'd be curious to.
Cool. Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I've always been a little bit ahead of my time. And believe me, when I first started talking about patterns, especially the academics, where they were like, yeah, but what about that? They like, so, we've sort of been trained in academia to focus on the exception to the rule, and like, who wants to talk about rules or patterns? Or, but to me, that's what's most amazing. Like, you've got over 30 million species, and they're all doing the same thing at some fundamental level. In fact, like, I'll just give you a quick example that I didn't include here. We did a deep dive, and this is how we do it. We did a deep dive into mutualisms, a personal favorite of mine, and always been interested in that question, and looked at over 180 different mutualisms in nature and said, what do they have in common? And what we were able to pull out was what we call 4 key criteria for enduring partnerships. Like, what are the 4 things that have to be in play, or else the mutualism falls apart? And I don't have time to go into them today, but then we took them to design and said, okay. And so the first place we applied it was an NGO called Canopy that is trying to get companies to stop using virgin forest. And their operating model is to partner to create a mutualistic relationship with the companies. And they were struggling and it wasn't working. So we brought in this framework of these 4 key criteria and did a deep analysis, and they found all the flaws in their thinking. And then they were able to reconcile those, to fix them, bring them back in line with the criteria. And I just learned the other day, they've tripled their staff because their work is just heading out, and they're having one win and one success after another because they took those principles and applied them. And the funny thing is, I've talked about it a couple times at talks, and I've had people come up to me afterwards and say, I think you've saved my marriage. So like, you never know where mutualisms apply. But yeah, I think there's a huge amount of potential to ask the question, like in collective behavior, what do we do with these design patterns and who might care, right? And how do they apply in collective decision making, all sorts of realms. And that is what I do. Like when I'm not at ASU and I'm not teaching, I'm working with these companies and thinking about how does this apply. And to me, that's really important to get it out of the lab and into the market, right? Out of the university and into practice, right? Like let's put this good work to practice. So let's talk.
Agreed. Yeah. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Brian. It looks like, hold on, I think there's a question in the chat from Alan Lee, who wrote, amazing talk, thank you. Are there evolutionary blind spots or tar pits found in nature to be wary of?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. We talk a little bit about there's local optima and global optima. And I would argue that most of nature's strategies, of course, are local optima. Like you would never want to design a hinge based on the human knee, like really bad design, right? So there's a lot of things that have what we might call evolutionary baggage. I'm guessing this is what your question is about. And so we do have to look at the design. And one of the things that we talk about is also the context, right? The context in which the design evolved, the context in which it's applied. Some things scale, some things don't scale. And that's why, to the question earlier from Michael, why you do need a little more rigor with the methodology so you don't quickly just like get randomly inspired by something and run with it. So I do think that that it's important to be mindful of that. And if we ignore context, then we run the risk of what I'm thinking you're asking in your question. And if I didn't answer it right, then please correct me. But those are some of the things that we definitely watch for. I'll call them evolutionary baggage.
Great.
Awesome. Well, we still have a few more minutes. Happy to chat more. If any of those questions, I'm still looking for a place to publish that paper. So if anybody has any ideas on where I might go that doesn't have word and citation limits that are justifiably there, that would be great to hear too.
Wonderful. And if anybody's thinking of any last minute questions while they're thinking, I just wanted to take a second first to thank Dana. Thank you so much for sharing today. I learned a lot as well, so that was very exciting. And I just wanted to remind folks that we do have one more talk in the Making Sense of Complexity series. So here's the information for that. If you haven't already registered, you can do so. It's listed on the SCAS events webpage, but this is our final talk coming up in 2 weeks. So just wanted to put that out there as well. I'm going to stop sharing now and just see if there's any last questions for Dana before we sign off.
Well, thank you for coming. I get to know a little bit about who I am, and look forward to hearing from you. Yes, I will check out +1. I've checked there again. Maybe I just have to like push it because they have some limits, but I'll look again. So thanks for that tip, Brian.
Great. All right.
Awesome.
Well,
thank you, everybody.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.